everyone, so we are on to week 2 of the quilt along. So this is the 9-patch quilt along with a twist. Last week we worked on the 9-patch block for this quilt, so hopefully you were able to get 50 of these blocks sewn together. If not, these videos will stay up, so do not worry, you will still be able to finish the quilt in your time. So this week we are working on the snowball block, and we will be sewing 49 of these snowball blocks. So I know the block looks a little bit difficult and 49 is a lot of blocks, but I'm going to give you a few tips that I like to use to make these blocks come together a little bit faster. So let's jump in and I'll show you how to sew this block together. All right, so last week we finished up all of these 9-patch blocks. So there are 50 of these. I had so much fun making these. I really love this fabric. I love how I think this quilt is going to turn out. So this week, in week 2 of the quilt along, we are going to be making the snowball block. I have my background fabric here, and I have some more of my jelly roll strips that will be cut down to use for the ends of the snowball block here. The first step here is going to be cutting the background yardage. So I have all my yardage here. How I like to cut yardage, I like to cut as much of it as I can at one time. So I have my yardage folded in half, and then I have it folded over so I have 4 layers of fabric here. Now, if you're going to cut like this, you're going to want to make sure you have a nice sharp rotary blade in your rotary cutter. So I like to change mine out pretty often. Whenever I feel that it's starting to get dull, I'll go ahead and change it out. But to cut through those 4 layers, you're going to want to make sure it's nice and sharp. So we're going to be cutting this background fabric into 6.5-inch squares. So to get started, I am going to use some of the lines on my mat. Now I'm going to make sure I'm kind of lined up with one of the lines here so that I know my fabric is pretty straight. And then I'm going to use the lines on the mat to cut a straight line to make sure I have a nice squared up edge to start with. So I'm going to look and make sure I've trimmed all these layers even, and it does not look like they are, because some of this yardage can be a little bit wonky depending on how it's cut. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off a 1/2 inch more just to make sure I have everything lined up nicely. So after that, I'm going to cut 6.5-inch or 6.5-inch strips from this yardage. And I'll probably only cut 2 strips for now, just so that I can show you how I typically do this. So I'm going to pull the rest of the yardage that I am still going to have to cut out of the way. You won't be able to see it on camera, but I do have selvage down at the bottom here, so I'm going to trim that off to square up another side of this fabric. So here is what I cut off down there from both of those strips, and then I can start cutting my 6.5 inches again. So I'm lining up the ruler with the bottom of the fabric, and I'm also going to line up a line as well on the side of the fabric, and then I will cut my squares. So these are 6.5-inch squares, and I have 4 in this pile and then 8. And then from the bottom where you couldn't see on camera, I have 8 more. So right now I have 16 squares and we need to get 49. So I'm going to cut up here. I can get 8 more. And then this fabric here is at the fold, and it's a nice piece of fabric when you fold it open. So I'm going to keep this in my scrap bin for another project. So just that fast, I have 24 squares here. So if I cut 2 more strips, I'll have 48, and then I'll just need to cut 1 more square. Now, I gave you plenty of wiggle room in your yardage requirements. Cut this fabric different if you want. I know this method may not work for everyone, and that is okay. So you will likely have some yardage left over once you're finished cutting. I'm going to square up the side again because when you're moving the fabric around, it may not be completely lined up. So I'm going to cut 3 more strips, even though I know I really only need 2. But what I'm going to do, so I can save some of this yardage for another project, is I'm going to open it up so I only cut 2 more. And I'll have those extra 6.5 inch squares from this, and I'm okay with that because what I'll probably do is go ahead and make them into snowball blocks. And I had some extra strips left over from my 9 patch blocks that I might make into 9 patches. Maybe I'll make some extra snowball blocks and make some nice throw pillows as well. So I'm going to get the rest of these squares cut. And then we'll take a look at how we are going to cut the jelly roll strips. All right, so now that all of my squares are cut, we're going to take a look at the jelly rolls. So we have our square, and we need to get the jelly roll patterned fabric onto the ends of it. Now we're going to need 4 2.5 inch square for each block. So that means we're going to need 196 squares. So how I'm going to cut these is they're already folded in half, which works out nice. And I'm going to line a few of them up at a time along my cutting mat. So I'll make sure they're all lined up and then get them lined up with a line on the cutting mat. Maybe I'll do just 3 at a time. And then, like I did before, I'm going to trim one of the ends to square it up. So basically I'm wanting to cut off the salvage end and then make sure they're all lined up nicely. And you can check just like before, because sometimes some of the salvage seems to be thicker than others. And then you can count if you'd like, or I had you pull out 13 jelly roll strips, so it should give you more than enough squares, probably a little bit more, because how we're squaring it up, all the jelly roll lengths are going to be a little bit different. I gave a little bit extra jelly rolls on both the 9 patch and this one, just to make sure you end up with enough fabric. So I'm just going to line up. This is a 2.5 inch ruler. It just makes it a little bit easier for me. I'm just going to line it up along the ends of the jelly roll. And then what I like to do also is see if a line is fairly straight on one end of the jelly roll as well, to kind of make sure it's staying straight. Now, if you notice that they seem to be getting a little bit wonky and you don't think your squares are quite that even, you could square it up again, and then you could just go back and start cutting your squares again. All right, so from those 3 strips, I got 48 squares. So I think that should be using about 12 jelly roll strips and then a little extra. So the 13, if you need to square up a few more times, or if you cut off a little bit more fabric should give you plenty of room to get the squares that you need. So I'm gonna finish cutting the rest of these and we'll take a look at how these blocks come together. All right, so now that we have everything cut, I have all of my 2.5-inch squares cut. There are a ton of them here. And I have my 6.5-inch squares cut. Now we're going to start sewing. So for me, I'm going to get 4 different squares for my block. So you could do this any way you would like. You don't have to, you could do them all the same. You could do 2 that are the same on each side. However you want to do it, I'm going to make sure I have a different square on each block. And we're going to be sewing them onto the corners, right sides together. Now, I'm going to share 2 different ways that you could do this. Now, the first way is to mark corner to corner on all of your little squares on the wrong side of it. So just mark corner to corner on all of them. I'm using a friction pen and this will erase when I iron it. However, when I'm using it on something like this, it's not something I worry about too much because I'm going to be sewing right along the seam. So if it doesn't come out, it's going to likely be hidden either way. Corner to corner on all of the squares. Now you can imagine with all of these squares, I think I said it was 196 squares. This can take you a little bit of time. So if you are like me and you're like, that does not sound like a fun time, I will show you another way that you can do this. So I have these laid out, but these 2 are fairly light. So for me, I think I might put them on opposite, the light ones on opposite sides. So there you can see I have that all prepped and ready to go. Now I'm going to go ahead and get one more ready just so I can show you how I might and you might prefer doing this. So let me get a few different squares. So right sides together. And I'm just going to line them up in the corner again. And just like these, we're going to be sewing side to side. So we're going to be sewing across the square along the diagonal from corner to corner. However, on this block, I'm not going to draw a line. I'm going to be using some diagonal seam tape. This is from Cluck Cluck Sew, and I absolutely love this. I almost always keep it on my sewing machine. So when we get over by the sewing machine, I'll show you how I use it. All right, so I have my block here with all of the lines drawn across the diagonal. I'm going to move the ones I'm not sewing right away off just so that you can better see what I'm doing here. Now I'm going to line up my needle right along that drawn line, and I'm just going to sew across there. And then I can go along to the other side, line up my square right at the corner, and do the same thing. So I'm going to get my needle lined up right along that drawn line, and I'm going to sew across that drawn line. So I'm going to do that for each side of the square. All right, so there we go. We have the line stitched along all 4 sides. Now, if you are like me and you don't want to have to draw all those lines across all those squares, what you can do is use the diagonal seam tape. So what I did was I removed a piece from that tape. It's kind of like a washi spool, and I lined up the red line with where my needle is all the way down my sewing machine. So what I would do is just line up one of my little squares in the corner of my block. I'll line up that one corner. Let me get one that's maybe a different color. You might be able to see it a little better. So I'm going to line up the one corner with where the needle is, and I need to line up the other corner that I'm sewing to along the red line. And then when I see that it's all lined up, I can start sewing, and if I watch here instead of my needle, I'll watch here and see that that corner stays lined up with the red line. And as long as it stays lined up with that red line down there, I'll have a nice straight row of stitches. So I've sewn right across there, across the diagonal, without having to mark anything. So I'll just go to the other corner, line up a square in the corner, line up with my needle, keep the other side lined up with the red line, and just sew. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is if you like things to be perfectly accurate, drawing the line, even though it takes a little more time, might be a better method, because some of us, our personality says we need everything to be very, very accurate, and that's okay. Now, this method may get you close. It may not be the most accurate though. I know that sometimes for me, if I am watching something while I do this and my mind wanders, maybe I'll not keep this lined up perfectly and I'll notice and I'll kind of bring it back. Or maybe I go back to old habits where I watch the needle instead of the end and we have a little bit of veering. Sometimes that will happen. And it may not be perfectly straight through there. So if you need it to be very, very accurate, drawing the line might be the safest way for you to go. So after you get these sewn up, you're going to trim. So let me show you that. All right, so we're going to trim off the ends of all of these, the squares drawn on here. So what I do is I like this 1/4 inch seam allowance ruler. This is a Accuquilt ruler. It's a trim it ruler. I just line that blue line up with where the stitches are and trim off. Now, if you like working with very, very tiny half square triangles, you could sew a row of stitches along here and have really tiny little cute half square triangles. So I'm going to go around all 4 of these, line up the blue line, the end of it, with my row of stitches, and just trim all of this off. And then once we get them trimmed, we'll press them open and it'll look just like that demo block over here. So let's go ahead and press these. So what I'm going to do is set the seams on all of them. Just add a little bit of heat, and then I'm going to gently press them so that the seams are pressed to the patterned fabric. I kind of really like to do that whenever I can in a pattern, because then you don't see the seam behind these light backgrounds. If you have a darker background that you're using, then it may not matter as much. But whenever I can, I like to press away from really light fabric. So see behind here, since this is a lighter one, you can kind of see that seam. And it's not like it's a bad thing. It's just I like to, you know, I like to avoid seeing it whenever I can. So there's that friction pen. When you add some heat along there, it'll just go away. So press these open, or not open, but to the side. And so there we have 2 of the snowball blocks finished. And so you'll just want to do that same thing with all of the 6.5 inch squares that were cut. Now, I typically don't sew one whole block at one time. So let me show you what I like to do when I have a bunch of the same blocks to do. I'm going to take this whole stack over to the sewing machine, and I'll go ahead and show you. So when I have a lot of the same block to sew, I will take all of the fabric over to my sewing machine. And if it's a half square triangle, that's really easy. I'll just chain piece a whole bunch of them. But here it's a little bit different because I'm going to be sewing a square onto each corner. However, what I like to do is I will get one square ready on one corner, and I'll sew across there. And you can see I'm still going to be using the diagonal seam tape instead of following a drawn line corner to corner. So I'll just sew right across there. And instead of cutting my thread and going on to the next corner, what I'll do is add another square on here on a new block, and also corner to corner here. So this is just, I'm just going to chain piece all of these together. So you can see I just have a little piece of thread back here holding these squares together that I'll snip later. And this not only can save you thread from having to pull it out and snip it if you don't have an automatic thread cutter, but I feel like it really saves time too, because I'm not snipping it, moving to the next side, and finishing one of these squares at a time. And then also, if you have all of your fabric stacked up, maybe you have a whole bunch of the same ones in a row. If you're wanting it to be a different square on each side like I do, then it'll be really easy, because all these, I'm getting all these fabrics out of the way on this one block. So I'm going to keep grabbing a new square, and I would typically have all 49 of these. I would have one square on one corner. So let's pretend I've done all 49 of these are all chain pieced together. So I would cut it, then I would grab my gypsy thread cutter here and just snip all of those chained threads. So I'd have all 49 of them with one square on one side, and I would just have 3 more to finish. So what I would do is I'd line that stack back up, and I'd say, okay, this is a different fabric that's not on here. I would put it on this side, and then I would line up and sew, and then I would grab the next block that just has one square sewn on there. I'd grab a fabric that's different than the ones on here and sew that one on. And I would do this with all of my blocks, all 49 of them. I would go ahead and get the second square sewn on. Then when I got all of them done, I would snip all the threads again, and I would add a third square on. So I'd look and see what I have that is a different fabric print. Grab one. Sew along the diagonal. Get the third one on. Line up and sew. Pretend I'm doing this 49 times, and then I would just have the last square to sew on. So I can look and see, you know, what fabric might look good on this one. At this time, I would have very few left to choose from, because I'd be at the bottom of the stack, and hopefully I would still have, you know, a nice variety. So there you go. I would have all of them finished. Then I can go trim them all at once and press them all at once. So I'd have all the steps that I would be able to get done at one time. And I feel like doing it this way really keeps you in a flow of sewing. And I feel like I get a lot more done that way, and I'm a lot more organized. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully, if you haven't tried chain piecing in that way, doing one corner at a time when you're doing a snowball block, and then getting them all finished, move on to the next, maybe try it out and see if you feel like it helps you get a lot more done in one sitting. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these blocks sewn. trimmed and pressed so you can take a look at all of them, but that is the snowball block, and it comes together really quickly. So let me know if you have not tried the diagonal seam tape, if you would like to try it out. I will put a link to it down in the description, and let me know if you have tried chain piecing like this, and if not, if you are going to give it a try. So let me get these finished and we'll take a look at all my blocks. All right, so here are all 49 of my snowball blocks. They are so pretty. I am loving this fabric, and I can't wait to see this whole quilt come together. So there are those blocks. And then here I have all of my 9-patch blocks. So it is going to be such a gorgeous quilt, and I hope that you are sharing your blocks and your progress in my Facebook group. I am loving seeing all the fabrics and everything that you all have been creating. So next week, I will show you how I like to bring this quilt together. So I'll show you how I like to sew the rows together and then bring the rows together in a quilt top. So next week, we will hopefully have the whole quilt top sewn together, and then I can just show you how I like to base a quilt and how I am going to quilt this quilt, just to give you some ideas on a nice basic quilting with straight lines. All right, so I will see you next week, and thanks so much for joining me in this quilt along. It has been so much fun so far. Bye.